A pleasure to meet all at last, and welcome back once again to video games that are totally awesome. So, I feel like that it's only fair that we do get to talk a bit about the Call of Duty series. Yeah, while I have talked a good amount of Call of Duty over the past 15 years or so, I feel like that two major contenders have yet to pretty much be mentioned in a really big setting here. Because while I was originally more than able to make full-length videos of the likes of the Black Ops series, well, the first two games especially were titles that I hadn't exactly made all that much for YouTube. And while I had talked a good amount of things for Black Ops 3 and 4, as well as a bit more of the likes of Cold War and Gulf War, basically 5 and 6, 1 and 2 might as well be talked about in a more full-length feature. In this case, 2 episodes of this show might as well cater to the likes of Black Ops 1 and 2. So, let's go ahead and do it. Call of Duty Black Ops 1. The first Black Ops game came out in 2010, the greatest year that could ever possibly happen. And there's no doubt about it. But here's the thing about the first Black Ops game. This was definitely something that truly defined a big generation of Call of Duty players out there. It was one thing for the unique storyline of the Modern Warfare series, as it was successful enough to not only generate some merchandise, but there was also a comic book series, there was a lot of parodies on YouTube and elsewhere, there were also some other things here and there. So you could say that the Modern Warfare series, despite being 2 games in by the time 2010 came and went, there was a lot of attention towards that series the most. Of course, there was a predecessor to Black Ops, as some might call it, known as Call of Duty World at War, which came out in 2008, between both Modern Warfare games that were released at the time. So, Black Ops definitely had a lot to give us. This was a storyline that most didn't really see coming. This was something that truly did mean big bucks for the likes of Treyarch. Yeah, the company Treyarch was able to collaborate with the original creators of Black Ops and give us one of the first major masterpieces that truly shattered a lot of first-person shooter limitations at the time. If you thought that such games out there that were FPS related like Doom, Wolfenstein, and etc. were awesome, well, here we go, less than 20 years later. Call of Duty Black Ops. This centers on the story of a man named Alex Mason. He was, of course, originally assigned to the Ops 40, a group that was at first stationed to take place in the 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion. Though I might as well say, the real opening of the game itself takes us to some sort of interrogation room. A series of televisions are in the room, and there's also a lit room up above with 2 shadows hovering over Alex Mason. He's strapped to the chair, unable to move, and unfortunately does not know where he is or who these people are that are talking to him. Yet he has a lot of information necessary for them. But this is info we're going to have to get back to at some point. Alex Mason and these interrogators don't really get off to a good start. Some zaps are pretty much put into place. And man, Mason at first was pretty apprehensive, a bit resistant, and at first was just jargling all around. Until eventually he decided to start talking a few things about his past. The Bay of Pigs invasion was basically the first act of the game that we play through. This is where Alex, as well as his comrades Frank Woods and Joseph Bowman, are all situated into a bar in 1961. A friend of theirs named Carlos basically allows them to take refuge while certain militia groupings gather outside. A number of vehicles and armed personnel wander into the bar and ask whom the people are. And when they go over to assault them, they fight back. Alex Mason is able to pull out a pistol and slow-mo take him down. At least that's how us players would have to deal with it. There's a good number of things where slow motion comes in handy. Especially if we're in one of those situations where, let's say, a door is blown up, a breach goes on, or a hostage situation happens. Lots of things happen in the Call of Duty games. And these slow-mo opportunities tend to take place pretty often. And this trope is certainly rather helpful. It does allow for there to be minimal screw-ups as well as having no excuse to basically slip up. Anyways, though, they make their way outside, hijack a car, and speed off. We cut back to Mason in the present time with the interrogators. They continue talking about various things. Alex, unfortunately, does start to fall unconscious until another zap brings him into full alertness. Of course, later into the day, back in Cuba, of course, when the Bay of Pigs invasion was going on, their main mission was, of course, to take down Fidel Castro. And that night they were spending at the bar was basically just a bit of a ploy, a means of cover, if you will. But they eventually do make their way to Castro's compound, where they're able to take down a lot of his men. And once they finally make it into Castro's own home, basically, it's yet another quick time event. Slow motion, pistol in hand, sights are aimed down at Castro's forehead, and history is basically written by the one and only Alex Mason, as well as Frank Woods and Bowman, of course. Even Carlos, I'm sure, could be more than entitled to earn a few things here and there. But until that happens, what they end up doing is, well, they make their escape via a plane that Carlos was able to steal from the nearby hangar. And while Mason takes a hold of an MG and fires outside, laying down some cover for them to eventually make their takeoff, unfortunately a blockade turns up on the tarmac. As Bowman states, well, they are literally blocking their way out. Woods realizes they'll have no way to get out. Mason offers to help, even jumping out of the plane midway. And he actually goes over to a nearby turret where he is able to shoot down the vehicles and blow them up, clearing a path for the plane's takeoff. Well, they actually do make it out of there, but Mason unfortunately does not. He gets apprehended, knocked out, and eventually wakes up to a nearby port where he sees none other than Castro standing in front of him. Apparently the guy that he shot earlier was a double. And Castro basically exchanges a few words here and there with a few Russians. They apparently have plans for Mason. Well, this is where we're brought over to a certain prison in Russia called Vorkuta, which is where Mason, believe it or not, makes some connections for about a year or so. And in this time that he spends in that prison, with a lot of hardships and even some fights every now and then, well, this is where he basically forms a big friendship with Viktor Reznov. Reznov is in fact a big part of the story here. Because if you remember World at War, well, you're definitely going to remember Black Ops for all time's sake. The thing is that Reznov was, believe it or not, actually a person whom used to work for a few Russians back in the day, as well as a German scientist. These names, of course, are initially kept away from us at first, but while these names are eventually labeled out as the likes of Dragovich, Kravchenko, Steiner, these men, according to Reznov, they were not like anybody that Mason had ever faced. Even Reznov himself had had difficulty trying to deal with the three, as he had built connections with them before in many ways, over a course of many years. He himself had ended up in Vorkuta, supposedly after a few things that he had done in the past. But this story eventually gets labeled to us. But for now, an escape plan is made. Step 1, secure the keys. Especially when an armed guard comes after Mason. Reznov distracts him. Mason grabs a rock, slams it into the guard's face, allowing the keys to be obtained. And then, this is where step 2 comes into play. Ascend from darkness, where they manage to get out of the caverns. Then you have steps 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and eventually 8. The thing is, this whole plan had to have been put together over a good amount of time. Kind of like how Joker must have been planning for months to create an epic breakout out of Arkham Asylum. And when you think about it, it's not far off, considering that the game was only a year old at the time. And maybe Black Ops could have gotten some inspiration from it, knowing that long-term planning is actually key to getting out of a really tight situation like being locked up in prison. You have to have a lot of knowledge and a lot of formality in mind, as well as lots of patience. But hey, it's a big, epic breakout that goes on. A prison riot of a century. I mean, you got Reznov enlisting Sergei Korolev, who is the monster of Magadan, according to him. And this Sergei guy is no joke. I mean, he might as well be like Shrek. But, hey, he's not from the swamp at least, right? Of course, they make their way to the armory. Mason assists in uprising the South with a slingshot that some fellow prisoners helped out with. Mason eventually obtains a Gatling gun from another armory. And man, it is an epic fight against the guards. Even more guards will begin to show up later on. Tear gas is used. Mason is thankfully dragged by Reznov to a safe location, a garage where motorcycles are used to get out of the way. They basically make an epic getaway on some motorcycles that they find in the garage, and they ride out using shotguns, Terminator style, to take down more guards that are after them. And a freight train comes over, and they make their way over to it, land on it. Unfortunately, Reznov doesn't make it alongside Mason. Apparently, Step 8, Freedom, was meant for Mason, not for Reznov. He gets recaptured. Or at least, that's what we're allowed to think for ourselves. But, wouldn't you know, Reznov actually does manage to come back. Later on, though. Because while Mason is reunited with his own team members from Op 40, Woods, Bowman, and whatnot, a new mission is eventually laid out. The Baikonur Cosmodrome, basically one of Russia's old spaceports, if you will. Soyuz 1 and 2 are basically scheduled for launching. And this was apparently where Dragovich would, believe it or not, make his last stand. At least that's how Woods and Mason would put it all together. Because all the members that are put around, including a guy known by the name of Grigory Weaver, who was essentially Russian himself, but more of a loyalist towards the American front. And he was originally tasked by the others as a means to destroy the rockets, sabotage the launches. Unfortunately, he gets captured midway. And that's basically where we first encounter Kravchenko, the second in command to Dragovich. And Kravchenko basically grabs a hold of his radio, relays it onto every frequency he can use, while we just see through him with some binoculars. Yeah, it's horrifying. Oh, but it's even worse though, because once he's finished talking on the radio, he basically grabs onto a hook and guts out Weaver's eye. Oh man, as if things were already brutal enough. Oh, but trust me, it'll get even better as time goes on. Because obviously rescuing Weaver is part of the priority, but sabotaging the rockets is still a big chunk of what you need to do. Because since Woods and Mason are now back together, Woods is basically able to make some comments about Mason being in Vorkuta for a while. Because what happens is that they're able to take down some nearby guards and disguise themselves as the patrolmen in question. They even encounter some other guards in which that they're able to thankfully relay some convincing Russian to them in an effort to get them to walk by and leave. Of course, while they're able to get closer to the base itself, along with the others catching up, Bowman especially is able to put out some Russian of his own as well, And while more guards are eventually taken down and more buildings are basically being explored, it unfortunately gets to a point where they're eventually exposed. Somehow, some way. Maybe it could be because the bodies were found, or it could be because something else went wrong. But anyways, they're basically made. And now the balaclavas that they're wearing all need to come off. At least that's what happens later on in the level when we actually see their faces again. But of course, even though Weaver is saved after all that we've been through here, they still have to go after that second rocket, Soyuz 2. They do make their way over there, and they're able to go up to the nearby control panel with a small armory inside of it, blowing the hole in the wall, or I might as well say, Woods says to Mason, blow a hole in that effing wall. Yeah, no joke. This was one of the first instances that an F-bomb was literally uttered that was actually audible, because sometimes they would be censored. In a pretty clever way, at least. Unfortunately, the rocket is about to launch, and they can't stop it. So what do? They have Mason go and grab the nearby rocket launcher, aim it up at the rocket, and guide it at it, blowing it to smithereens mid-flight. And man, the explosion is insane. But it's even worse when you understand there's a lot of debris going to fall down. Thankfully, they make their way into the innards of the base itself, underground, where they are able to scour over to the rooms, finding Dragovich. And while they are able to successfully clear every room out like clockwork of all the enemies, they would eventually catch up to Dragovich, even going through a car chase. And while we unfortunately don't get to play through that segment, Mason and the interrogators back in the present basically do discuss this sort of thing. Mason, however, could not confirm the kill. Dragovich being burned to a crisp, like a charcoal briquette, as Woods would put it, supposedly was the information that he needed at the time. So he couldn't confirm the kill. He couldn't have even known if Dragovich was inside that burning wreckage, let alone even around in general. But in any case, though, somehow they do know that Dragovich is alive afterwards. 5 years would pass before 1968, well into the height of the Vietnam War. And it was quite a big time to be alive. The height of both war as well as counterculturalism, and even the struggles of presidency, especially after the assassination of Kennedy, whom, wouldn't you know, there was actually a level where you do get to go into the Pentagon in a limousine along with Secretary McNamara, and Mason also was accompanied by CIA agent Jason Hudson. Yeah, it's also crazy when you think that one of the interrogators says he was at the Pentagon too. And just think, that's impressive. Mason gets to ride in a limousine after his escape from Vorkuta. President McNamara, the secretary of the president, Kennedy himself, and eventually Kennedy himself gets a chat with Alex Mason in his office. That's quite an honorable experience. Considering it's first person, it probably makes you feel like that you're the one getting to meet the likes of McNamara and Kennedy. Anyways, though, 1968 was a bit of a boiling point. It was certainly a big time for Mason and Woods to be alive, and they actually were pretty happy with things, even if they were a bit weird. I mean, Woods, you know what he looks like, right? At least that's how Mason would interpret it. And this is also where he meets Jason Hudson for the first time. So Woods, Hudson, and Mason Bowman, they're basically the four big main characters here. While we also do get the likes of Weaver coming in for the ride as well, the thing is, they're all through with their unique jobs that happened back then. Vietnam War was apparently the biggest thing that they had to work with at the time. Because after all, those VCs in good old North Vietnam and South Vietnam essentially were headlocked in a pretty awful fight to the death. Yeah, the town of Saigon was basically in danger. As we know what happened in real life, well, that place no longer really exists. But in the game here, while we do get ourselves a first-hand look at how the Vietnam War worked, with a number of notable operations that happened, Khe Sanh, Hue City, and a few different missions in particular that did allow for us to experience that whole thing, well, guess what? In the middle of Hue City, Reznov comes back, supposedly alive and well after what happened in Vorkuta. Yeah. A number of different lines that he had others out is impeccable. Dragovich apparently spreads like a cancer. But the thing is that for Hue City, what they had to do was find a defector's dossier. That's apparently the main reason why they went there, to grab that exact document. A dossier in particular that pointed out to something of Dragovich himself. And even though they were able to make it out of there, albeit being surrounded by VCs, or Vector Charlies as they're dubbed, basically the Viet Cong, if you will. It certainly is quite a nasty battle. In fact, all of these things that were Vietnam War related sure were one of a kind to experience. Even by today's standards, I'm sure that a lot of things out there would probably be different. Imagine making Call of Duty Black Ops today. Vietnam, Chinese censorship. Remember what happened with Dead Rising Deluxe? Yeah. No doubt that the same thing could happen here if they intended to either remaster the Black Ops duology or whatnot. But then we are eventually labeled out to Jason Hudson's perspective. His own set of missions alongside Weaver and a couple other members of the CIA. Basically, they're after a guy known as Daniel Clark. And this guy from England apparently had worked with the likes of Dr. Friedrich Steiner on some chemicals. A compound in particular called Nova 6. This chemical was apparently bribed as being so deadly that if poisoned, you'd be dead long before you even hit the floor. That's how Hudson himself would interpret it. But the thing is that Clark apparently not only bears connections to working with Steiner on Nova 6 itself, but there was also a set of numbers. These numbers in particular will actually become rather important later on. Because apparently what had happened is that Mason had gone through something really bad back in Vorkuta. And while they couldn't quite picture it all that much, the thing is, there was a so-called number station constantly being referenced throughout all of the interrogation parts in the game between the interrogators and Mason in that room in particular. That's basically the present day events that we have here. But all of these levels that we're playing through and all these different missions are basically just backstories in the timeline itself, beginning with Bay of Pigs in 1961 and ending at some point after all of this stuff. While it's not exactly confirmed at what it is, we could say that it happens after 1968, probably 69 even. But regardless of what it is, this so-called number station actually proves to be a big part of the overall story. A part of the threat of Nova 6 being released by the likes of Dragovich and Kravchenko, along with Dr. Steiner, well, Clark is thankfully able to be helpful, not just in providing some answers to the likes of Hudson and Weaver, especially after being beaten and having glass fed to him, but man, he actually does, believe it or not, have a lot of ways to navigate through the rooftops, and even has them jump leaps of faith. Oh man, they are actually pretty exhilarating when you think about it. It's just impressive that Hudson and Weaver are able to jump from like 3 stories from the air into the balcony of other buildings and live through them every time. Not even getting a sprain from the falls. But I mean, it's a game. We can't really expect a lot of realistic physics to be involved. Also, Clark apparently has access to a lot of weapons in the area in particular that they were inside of at the time. All these houses that they were all going into and all these rooftops that they were navigating through, they are thankfully able to restock on ammo and even get a hold of newer weapons if they have to. And I will say this level is probably the best if we're talking about finding specific guns in particular. Even the Grim Reaper rocket launcher is found in this level. You know, it's that unique square thing with 4 separate holes for the rockets. Yeah, it was a pretty unique thing to use back in the 1960s. Unfortunately, though, there's a point where Weaver, Hudson, and Clark are basically hanging over the edge of a rooftop, and Hudson still has the guts to ask Clark some questions while there's hundreds of bullets visibly flying all over the place. That's impressive that they're able to keep calm and brave in such a huge, tense situation like this. Unfortunately, one bullet does successfully pass through Clark's skull, instantly killing him. Yeah. And this was just when Hudson was about to receive the answers he needed for the numbers in particular, and the station it connects to. So, he unfortunately had to let Clark go, letting him fall to the ground right there. And we basically just see what happens to him. Of course, while Hudson and Weaver are able to eventually make their way down safely and regroup with other CIA agents in a van, Hudson relays to them that they are now going to Mount Yamantau, Russia, the Ural Mountains. After all, Clark does inform them that Steiner's home turf is in that area, so that's basically their next stop. But for now, though, we cut back to the likes of Mason's story, or at least his end of the story, where he, Woods, Bowman, and whatnot are still in the middle of Vietnam. Basically, there's a number of operations going on in Vietnam still. Essentially, this is the team called MACV-SOG, first established in 1964. Yeah. And of course, Woods himself did state that during the events of the Vietnam War, what were going to happen will include black propaganda, POW rescue, strategic recon, and a number of other things. So, those days in Nam, where MACV-SOG, good old Mason, Woods, Bowman, etc. would all find solace from within, fighting for their own home country. And also, especially knowing the fact that Hudson would get his hands on some answers. The connections between Dragovich, Kravchenko, Steiner, the Vietnam War, and even with the likes of Fidel Castro. Knowing what had happened at that time in the Bay of Pigs invasion, it's quite clear that all of this will amalgamate to a unique and conclusifying ending. But for now, though, there's still a number of things to do in Nam. There's basically a point where they have to navigate through some swamps, there's a lot of stealth action involved, a helicopter is shot down, and eventually they have to disable a Zulu, a ZPU in particular, that is preventing air support from coming in, known as Kentucky. Of course, once they do make their way out of there, though, they also have to go up to the Mekong River towards Laos. And this is also where Reznov will accompany them on the trip. They're basically riding on a bow with some guns in hand, and Mason is mostly the one in charge of shooting down the Viet Cong on the way to Laos. And well, when all's said and done, they make their way up to a large ship, take sniping positions, but eventually they fall to the ground, almost unconscious. That's where the VCs are able to capture them and take them to one of their hideouts underground. Yeah. I should probably also mention, though, that it's by this point where we actually hear the true intentions of Dragovich, Kravchenko, and Steiner, as another level of the story does give us the full story of Reznov, because back in Vorkuta, sometime before their plan was initiated to break free and escape, he did tell Mason about his life. His father used to be a violinist, after all, for his people in Russia. But unfortunately, the Nazis did him in. It's supposedly collaboration. Oh my gosh, Chew. Chew, no! He's not even for you. Come on. Come here, Chew. 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 Chew, stop. Enough. I should probably also mention that it's by this point where we hear the full story of Reznov and his long-term beef with the likes of the three. Kravchenko, Dragovich, Steiner. They've basically become his worst enemies. And it's because of something that happened just after World War II. Because in late 1945, he did explain that he had a friend named Petrenko. He was his closest friend and ally who fought alongside him from the siege of Stalingrad to the fall of Berlin. And there was even once a time where his father was a popular violinist. But unfortunately, the Nazis did him in. Anyways, though, an old shipping vessel was stranded along the icy seaboard. And Reznov and his team, alongside the three that were previously mentioned, went over to the ship to check it out. And supposedly this is what they were carrying, some supposed precursor to Nova 6. And while Nova 6 itself was just a manifested poison that they had put together from their science department, the thing is, it was in storage inside this vessel the whole time. And when they went inside, Reznov's own team, they were pretty much captured and locked away. A full-on double cross, pretty much. Dragovich, Kravchenko, and Steiner full-on betrayed Reznov. Killed his friends with the Nova 6 gas itself. However, they were able to break free as the English had descended on the scene just as well, and while they would fight their way out, Reznov would arm some explosives to the ship, destroying it, and hopefully preventing Nova 6 from falling into the wrong hands. However, it did not work at all. He himself would eventually find himself in the middle of Vorkuta and had remained there ever since. He and Mason would practically work it out overnight. And that's how the whole plan to break out of Vorkuta had occurred. Because Reznov was not only determined to get back at the three for betraying him and causing the deaths of his comrades, but Reznov, he, believe it or not, also sabotaged the so-called operation that went on inside of Mason's head. Because let's not forget that Vorkuta wasn't just a big prison, but it also was a place for so-called mind experimentations. Like I said, the full details on this aren't exactly clear, but one thing is for sure. There's a bunch of numbers that you could hear in the background. And this typically is when we're playing as Mason. But hey, I might as well mention the Ural Mountains. Because Hudson, unfortunately, while he is able to successfully make way over to where Steiner is supposedly at, a broadcast of Steiner reveals he is actually at Rebirth Island now, not at the Ural Mountains anymore. And so that's basically their next stop. They unfortunately end up going through an avalanche and having to jump off the cliff just to get themselves out of trouble. They make their way to Rebirth Island while McV, Sog, and all three of the members that we know of, Mason, Woods, Bowman, they're basically in a bit of a ruse alongside the VCs and the Russians. Basically inside of one of their tunnel complexes in the middle of Nam, what happens is that they're forced to play a bit of Russian roulette. It does not go so well. Woods and Mason forge a plan. Even though there's lots of guns aimed at them, they could still work things around. With some quick thinking, they are able to incapacitate a majority of the people in the room and pursue the Russian that had actually bombarded the crap out of Bowman's skull. Bowman died, cursing the others till the very end, telling them that he is not afraid, and ended up paying the price for it. But the Russian was thankfully quickly tracked down and taken out for Bowman. This is where things get incredibly fiery, because when Woods and Mason escape, they make their way over to a helicopter. They're able to, in fact, use the VC's own medicine against them. And man, is it awesome. Controlling a helicopter in Call of Duty isn't something you don't really get to do often. But in Black Ops, they sure did manage to savor it quite nicely in this whole scene in the game. I mean, you got Woods and Mason bombarding the crap out of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, heading up through the rivers and the mountainsides where more helicopters are showing up, vessels are aiming mortars at them, missiles, rockets, bullets, etc. It's madness. But hey, that's the thing about hijacking one of the Huey choppers. Anyways, though, they finally are able to make their way over to Kravchenko's compound, in which they're able to scramble inside and even pick up a flamethrower on the way there. So, yeah, it's one of the only instances where the flamethrower attachment for assault rifles seem to come in handy throughout the main campaign mode. But once they get in there, Kravchenko, unfortunately, he's pretty formidable, stomps on Mason, and Woods, oh man, he comes up against Kravchenko, stabbing him, and while he is able to arm an explosive and even throw himself out the window with Woods right behind him, it's unknown exactly if the blast either killed him, or Woods, or both, or maybe they both lived from it. Mason unfortunately couldn't tell, but that's where Reznov once again shows up out of the blue. He is once again able to convince Mason to move along with the current plan at hand. Because Kravchenko supposedly is considered KIA at that moment. That blast was pretty epic after all. The next target, of course, was Steiner. And much like Hudson, Mason was able to figure out that Steiner is now at Rebirth Island. So that's where we're both heading to. At first we played Mason and his little game of stealthy intervention, where he is able to infiltrate the likes of Steiner's own facilities and eventually make haste as his cover is eventually blown and he has to fight his way through, shoot everybody down in his way like the Doomslayer. And once he finally intercepts Steiner, he catches him in a room. Oh man, it's like full-on revenge is manifested after so many years have passed. Reznov supposedly sets off the one bullet in the handgun to take out Steiner once and for all. Mason does confirm that Reznov was the one who did it, but Hudson had a different idea. The interrogators, of course, confirmed this as well, that Hudson actually witnessed Mason do it. Because after all, while Hudson had to go through a lot of struggles on his own, including actual deployments of Nova 6, thankfully they had hazmat suits to get around that problem, he eventually does catch up to Mason. But oh man, Mason's the one that shoots him down. And now what happens? They were forced to knock him out and bring him in for custody. And questioning, of course. And this all leads to what we eventually have gotten at this very point. Basically from the point that Mason woke up to the point where Mason is now, unfortunately, seeing Hudson again. It turns out that the interrogators the whole time that were up in that room talking to him are actually Weaver and Hudson. Because after all, the cloak does reveal itself and Mason can now see through the glass. And the glass does reveal Weaver is still up there. Their voices are, of course, slightly modified in a way through the microphone. Some vocotion is taken through here in order to conceal their identities. Hudson, of course, does get into Mason's room in person, telling him Reznov's dead. The Russians were the reason why Mason is now mentally screwed over. His mind, unfortunately, was playing a lot of trickery on him this whole time. Mason does still feel a bit rebellious about it though. In his mind, we definitely see a lot of stuff unfold. A lot of messages, a lot of flashbacks, a lot of old memories that have happened over the years. The numbers, of course, keep on repeating themselves. And he is still unable to find out what is going on. The whole thing about this number situation is, well, when Hudson finally catches up to Mason and explains everything to him, Reznov died in Vorkuta during the escape. In all the years Mason thought that he was still with them, it was just a little ploy in his mind because of the numbers coding that happened back in Vorkuta prior to the escape. The thing is, Kravchenko, Steiner, Dragovich, they actually implanted the numbers into his head, some sort of code / broadcast that is supposedly the equivalent to that of the real-life CIA's experiments known as MK Ultra. This sort of mind control was a means of wiping people's memories and mentality and basically using them as an ulterior forum for control over another person's mind and body. They're able to bend to their own will and succumb to one's own power. Mason, unfortunately, ended up becoming another big victim of Dragovich himself and his ultimate plans for taking down the West. These number sequences and that broadcast in particular were all coming from a certain station that is out there somewhere, and yet Mason unfortunately could never figure out what it was until one last time. He looked deep into the recesses of his mind, where he is in fact able to find out exactly what this station is. After thinking back to what happened when he woke up and saw Castro in front of him, Rusalka. That was the station all along. That large ship that we saw sometime after the start of the game during the Bay of Pigs invasion, that was apparently the number station the entire time. I mean, Dragovich did tell him he had special plans for him. This was apparently it, the whole entire time. And now Mason has fully recollected this old memory from years ago. The Rusalka in Cuba. That was the location of the number station. And as a result, Hudson, the CIA, and Mason himself would all band together to form an all-out assault on the Rusalka itself, prior to the full-on broadcasts that are supposed to trigger everyone's number sequences and allow for them to basically become Dragovich's finest agents. But unfortunately, Dragovich has now been found. So, Mason, Hudson, and the others scramble together onto the tops of the ships and then proceeds to the lower decks, going down the stairs, fighting through the corridors, and taking out everybody in every room possible until they finally get to a certain lab, in which that Mason, unfortunately, is hanging from the edge, and Dragovich appears in front of him, out of the shadow. He's prepared to take him out for essentially failing his duty as one of his agents. But Hudson was able to buy time, and Mason was able to grab him down and eventually pay him back. Dragovich is finished. After a chokehold goes on underwater, Mason basically has had enough. He and Hudson barely make it out of the ship, and because it's sinking, they had to swim their way up through the rest of the way. Reznov appears one final time, telling Mason through his own mind that he's done it. He done what he couldn't have. He swore to pay him back for the things that's happened over the years. Reznov's comrades had gotten killed, and the three were horrific manipulators, collaborators, and warlords that deserved to be punished. Reznov could never do it after so many years of time had passed, but yet, all that happened was a failed rescue / escape from the Vorkuta prison complex. But Mason proved to be more wilier than expected. He was quite a hardy soldier in the American forefront, but at the same time, he not only made a big promise to a former friend of his years ago, but he also had to contend with members of the CIA as a means of giving them info that they needed to figure out what was up this whole time in Vorkuta and elsewhere, and what was going on all over the place. For 10 years almost, a lot has happened. Just think, we went from Cuba to Nam to Russia to Rebirth Island and a number of other places as well. And what we get here, an epic setup where ships and planes are all flying through the air, sailing over the seas, as Mason, Hudson, Weaver, and the others are all together at last. They have won victoriously. And it goes to show, you certainly can't beat a Black Ops agent. I feel like I've talked a lot about this game already here. And to tell you the truth, there's also multiplayer and zombies. And while this definitely wasn't the first case for either of which, Black Ops Zombies actually did a fantastic job. There was a lot of memories to be taken, especially from the map known as Kino der Toten. And there's also some others along the way as well. The multiplayer mode also does allow for us to have a lot of different maps that we played throughout the campaign mode, especially in the likes of the Ural Mountains, Rebirth Island, and we even got to fight along the ship, the Rusalka itself. So, talk about recycling a lot of unique elements and making them into maps for multiplayer modes. Also, we can't forget about the guns. There's a lot of great weapons out there. You have the HK-21, for instance, the Grim Reaper rocket launcher, the FAMAS, and even the G11. Yeah, and that's just to name a few, because there's a pretty big variety of different weapons to choose from in this game. A lot larger than the norm. So, all of this put together means I got a pretty big score to offer for this. It's probably going to be as much of a classic today, considering that 15 years have now passed. And with that in mind, 9.2 out of 10.1 is what I'm going to be giving this one. While I'll say that with 5 other games that have since come around, I can't really say that they're all going to be that much better. But you know what? I might as well talk a lot more about Black Ops 2 tomorrow. So, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side for more.